Good morning, everybody. We're just going to take a few seconds while everybody starts logging in, and then we'll get started. All right. Good morning and welcome to the Northeast Wisconsin Chambers Coalition Legislative Dialogue. NEWCC consists of chambers in Fond du Lac, the Fox Cities, Green Bay, Oshkosh, and Waupaca. I am Sadie Parafinik, the President and CEO of Envision Greater Fond du Lac. I want to welcome and thank my colleagues and their teams for helping organize this event. Thank you, Becky Bartosik, President and CEO of Fox Cities Chamber, Lori Radke, President and CEO of the Green Bay Chamber, John Casper, President and CEO of Oshkosh Chamber, and Terry Schultz, President of the Waupaca Area Chamber. Today's agenda includes 2 speakers followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our first speaker is John Kirchner, Executive Director, Midwest Region Congressional and Public Affairs Division from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. John represents the Chamber throughout the states of Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. He stays busy. Kirchner helps develop and implement the Chamber's grassroots, legislative, and political activities in the area. In addition, he works closely with state and local chambers, as well as with members of Congress in his region to further the legislative priorities of the Chamber. Previously, Kirchner spent 8 years as a public relations manager at Marvin Windows and Doors, leading the company's public affairs and corporate communications efforts. Before that, he was the political director for the Minnesota Republican Party. Kirchner received his BA in political science from St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, and now resides in Edina, Minnesota. There is a lot of political in that bio. We're very pleased and honored that you can join us today, so I will kick it over to you, John.
Thank you, Sadie, for having me. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I yearn for the times when I can be back in a tiny little rental car driving across northeastern Wisconsin, visiting with you all in person. But in the meantime, we are here and we are virtual, but we are glad to be here. Lots to talk about here quick. I will be brief because I know we've got a full program today, but there is a lot going on in the federal government. With obviously the new Biden administration, there are a new set of priorities. Some of them are going to be good for the business community. Some of them are going to be challenging and require us to play a certain amount of defense. I think a good example of that, we've got a narrow majority in the House for the Democrats and in a 50-50 Senate. So the Democrats, need to kind of keep their troops in line and everybody in order to get some meaningful legislation passed. And they proved they could do that. This just, I think yesterday, they did the final pass of the new COVID relief package, the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, which frankly was about much more than COVID relief, but they proved that they can keep their members together. They used a process called budget reconciliation, which is a Senate process, and that has to do with if it is a bill that has to do with the budget and there's no policy kind of stuff included. If they're budget numbers, then you can get by with passing with 51 votes. You don't need the 60 votes to break a filibuster. So they use that process, which isn't new. If you recall back in 2017, when the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was passed, Republicans used that same budget reconciliation process to pass the big tax cut. So it's not new, but it is We were a little bit disappointed. We were pushing for a more bipartisan solution. All the other COVID relief packages have been very, very broadly bipartisan up until now. And we were hoping that this could be the same. We think it's important for America. We think it's important for our businesses and everyone that this is a bipartisan effort and not partisan. But that didn't happen, as we know. Our belief on the package, it should have been targeted, it should have been temporary, and it should have been bipartisan. It didn't meet any of those three criteria. There is some good things in the bill that we like. There is state and local funding for cities and states and localities. We had hoped that that number would be directly tied to loss related to COVID, but we're finding that many states and localities are getting far more money than they've lost due to COVID. And some believe it's kind of a bailout for some of these cities and states. We believe that with the K-12 education funding, yes, we need to have K-12 education funding. We wanted that to be targeted in getting kids back into the schools. A lot of that money is not going to be spent till later this year or next year. So we felt that needed to happen. There are some good business things in there. There's new funding for restaurants, new programs of that nature. It's missing litigation reform, which we're still pushing for, and I know the WMC has done that on the local state level there in Wisconsin. It was missing an extension of the PPP because the PPP program ends at the end of March, and there's a lot of companies that are kind of in the queue right now. And if they're not able to get through, they shut it down. They're not going to get access to that. So we need to make sure that those funds are still out there. But with that, what also wasn't in it was the $15 minimum wage. It was in the House version of the bill. The Senate parliamentarian ruled that it did not meet the criteria for budget reconciliation. So it was taken out. We anticipate we're going to be seeing the $15 minimum wage come back. That is something we continue to push hard against. We don't think a one-size-fits-all minimum wage is going to work for America. The needs of Northeast Wisconsin are very different from the needs of Chicago or somewhere on the East Coast or somewhere on the West Coast. So we certainly want to make sure that we're speaking on behalf of the business community regarding that $15 minimum wage. Another big issue that was passed earlier this week that we've heard of before and are going to continue to hear about is this PRO Act. This is, if you remember, several years ago with card check. This is a big pro-union bill that the Democrats are pushing. They pushed it in the previous Congress. They're pushing it again now. It's very similar to what we've seen before. It undermines private ballots. It invalidates all the right to work laws in all the states. So it removes a lot of the rights that employers have to educate their employees as it relates to organizing a union. So it passed the House. We anticipated that. It's going to move to the Senate. We don't think it's going to go very far there because they don't have 60 votes in the Senate to pass it. But this is one of those things that we're going to keep talking about. And you're going to hear a lot from me on because we don't want to reward bad behavior and just say, well, it passed the House, it's not going to pass the Senate, we'll leave it be. We need to make sure that this doesn't gain any traction in Congress. And so you're going to hear me talk a lot about this. Similarly, one other issue that I think we have a tremendous opportunity for some bipartisan work on is going to be on infrastructure. You could talk to any Republican or any Democrat, and they're going to tell you how important infrastructure is. And that's one of those few issues that everyone's on the same page. That's very good for every state. That's very good for Northeast Wisconsin. And it's very good, I think, for Congress to be able to do something in a bipartisan fashion. Now, the challenge with that is there's a few challenges in infrastructure. Challenge number one is how do you pay for it, right? We feel it needs to be a dedicated fund that goes right into infrastructure, that it doesn't come out of some larger general fund type budget in the government, that it needs to have its own dedicated resource for long-term funding. It's currently funded by the federal gas tax, the federal fuel fee. We haven't raised the gas tax since 1993. So we're building a 21st century infrastructure on $1993. And as a result, a lot of states, red states, blue states, have all been raising their gas tax around the country to pay for infrastructure because the federal government hasn't paid for it. There's talk about doing some sort of vehicle miles traveled. VMT opportunity on the gas tax. I don't see that really going anywhere. I don't know that a lot of people are comfortable yet with the government tracking where they're going and how far they're driving. So we need to find a meaningful way to pay for it. That's challenge number one. If we can figure out challenge number one, we need to figure out challenge number two is, what is infrastructure? Is infrastructure just roads and bridges? Maybe it is. But as we're learning through this pandemic, there is a significant need for rural broadband upgrades across this country, both for homes and for businesses. So, is it roads and bridges? Is it rural broadband? Is it ports? Is it rivers? Is it railroads? Is it airplanes and airports? What is infrastructure? We need to define that, because the needs of the middle of America are far different from the needs of many of both coasts and many cities on the East Coast and the West Coast. So we need to come to some sort of conclusion about what is it. And then the other challenge we have is we have a federal permitting process that takes way too long to get these projects permitted, and we don't currently have the workforce to build it. Now, there's unemployment's high right now as it relates to COVID, but those numbers are going to come down. And even if everyone in America right now was employed, we'd still have jobs without workers. And part of it is going to be a trained and skilled workforce that we haven't talked about it as much because in the last year, because of COVID and the high unemployment, but we're going to be talking about that again. So we need to train a workforce to build this infrastructure, but we think it can be done. We've got a big push, build by the 4th of July, that we're really focused on getting Congress to pass a bill by the 4th of July. And so you're going to be hearing some more from us on that as well. And then in the interest of time, I'll touch on one more thing that you've probably all heard from me. And I know I've talked to Sadie and I've talked to Kurt and a lot of others on this, but is the Office of Management and Budget is looking at changing what the metropolitan, the MSA designation is. And they're looking at changing that from, I believe, 50,000 up to 100,000. And this is significant for a lot of cities, certainly in my region, because what that means is if they lose that designation as a metropolitan area, that loses a lot of access to federal transportation funding and a lot of different kind of funding. So we're pushing hard on that. We've pushed out a lot of resources on that. If you haven't seen it, let me know. I can get those to you. I think comments are due to the OMB on March 20. And I know a lot of congressional delegations are aware of this and working on this, but I'd also encourage you to reach out to your congressional delegation on this as well. So with that, in an interest of covering a lot in a short amount of time to leave some time for a friend, Mr. Bauer, I don't know if, Sadie, if we're doing Q&A now or if we're going to pass it to Kurt and do it all later, whatever you prefer.
I will turn it over to Kurt and then we'll do Q&A at the end.
Perfect.
So thank you, John. Now I'd like to introduce and welcome Kurt Bauer, President and CEO of WMC. Kurt became the 5th head of Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, WMC, in 2011. Founded in 1911, WMC is the combined Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce, Wisconsin Manufacturers Association, and the Wisconsin Safety Council. WMC represents 3,800 employers of all sizes and from every sector of the economy. In 2020, WMC was recognized as the State Chamber of the Year for its advocacy, information delivery, and general support of Wisconsin businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to joining WMC, Bauer spent 18 years working for financial industry trade groups, including serving as CEO for both the Wisconsin and Arizona Bankers Associations. Bauer is immediate past chair of the Council of State Manufacturers Associations and serves on the boards of the National Association of Manufacturers and Council of State Chambers of Commerce. He is also a member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Committee of 100, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Public Affairs Committee, and the UW System Business Advisory Council. Bauer is a Wisconsin native and a graduate of UW-Madison. Welcome, Kurt, and I would like to say thank you for all of the resources you provided all of us during the COVID-19 pandemic. They were timely, they were trustworthy, and we enjoyed sharing them with our members. Welcome, Kurt.
Thank you, Sadie. I appreciate it. I appreciate being here, especially talking to the chambers that are on this call. They really are best in class in the state. We're blessed with very strong chambers in the state of Wisconsin, and we need them. And that, I think, really shown true last year during COVID-19. Of course, we're still in it, but last year, I think the chamber community stepped up in a big way to support businesses. So my high praise and salute to Sadie, Becky, John, Lori, and to Terry in their respective chambers. You did a great job, and we appreciate the partnership a great deal. And we also appreciate the partnership with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. As Sadie just mentioned, I'm on 2 of their committees, work very closely with the U.S. Chamber, think very highly of them. Frankly, it would be very difficult for all of us to do our job without that support that we get in Washington, D.C. And John mentioned the Metro statistical area reform. WMC is in the process of a sign-in letter. It affects a lot of the chambers on this call, so we want to make sure that our voices are heard. So by the end of the day today, we're hoping to get chambers sign on to that letter, and we'll send it over to OMB and to the congressional delegation, because it is actually a very big deal. It has an impact. So we talk a little bit about what's going on at the state level, but let me, if you'll indulge me, John talked about the PRO Act that was passed by the Congress, a bad piece of legislation that would undo an awful lot of good that has been done here at the state level, including the fact that we are a right to work state. We celebrated the 6-year anniversary of being a right to work state on Tuesday, probably the most significant achievement of my career. Now almost 30 years in trade association work. Very proud of the fact that Wisconsin became a right to work state. We want to be able to keep it. We don't want Washington to have the arbitrary power to just decide for us what our rules are going to be. And just a point to that, when we passed right to work, obviously I was very proud. I went to one of my meetings with my colleagues, and I walked in with kind of a chip on my shoulder, maybe a little cocky, and said, yep, we are now the 25th right to work state in the country. And one of my colleagues, who was far more tenured at that time than me, looked at me and said, yes, but can you keep it? And that's always the question, because all of the reforms that we are able to pass are subject to being repealed in the next legislative or congressional session. And that, I think, is very sobering, and why all of us in the business community need to continue to be diligent and stay on top of things. Let me just make a couple comments. We're basically at the 1-year anniversary of the Safer at Home order that actually happened on March 25th. Unprecedented event in Wisconsin's 173 years of statehood. We've survived other pandemics, including the Spanish flu, which most people compare COVID to, 2 world wars and Great Depression, without ever having to shut down the economy. And just reflecting a little bit on how this has gone, we've had business closures, mandates, restrictions. I think sometimes the government response has been confusing, chaotic, disorganized, and at times autocratic. John mentioned a one-size-fits-all approach as it relates to the minimum wage. I think that that's true on some of these closures, even on the mask mandates. We had difficulty with the governor's mask mandates because a cloth mask doesn't work in every environment. Particularly in some industrial settings where it can be saturated with certain chemicals. So one size fits all approach doesn't work is one of the things I think that we've learned in COVID-19. I think another thing is that all workers are essential. Of course, the Safer at Home order defined what was essential workers. Frankly, in Wisconsin, it was very broad, and we appreciate that. We actually worked with the governor on the definitions. But I think that one thing that we've learned is that all work is essential going forward. And I hope those are lessons that we learned in the post-pandemic environment. I also just want to praise the private sector. I don't think that we have gotten enough credit for how we have responded rapidly and effectively to COVID-19. I think that we have shown incredible resiliency. Look at we started 2020 with 3.3% unemployment. We peaked at about 15% unemployment. Now we're down to 5.5% again. So it shows you how resilient the business community is. And the response, you have healthcare professionals and what they've been able to do, nothing short of heroic. our grocers, certainly manufacturers, food processors, and packaging, but of course, many of them retooled to provide personal protective equipment. Banks and credit unions with their assistance to their customers on paycheck protection loans, the telecoms and the Zoom economy. We've needed them, and I think they've performed magnificently. Transportation and delivery, where would we be without Amazon and all of the folks that deliver packages and groceries to your front doors? And of course, the pharmaceuticals. Operation Warp Speed has been nothing short of an amazing success. And I think we have all of those sectors and many more to thank for all of the things that the private sector has done. I think when you compare the private sector response versus the public sector response to COVID-19, I think that we have really shined, and I congratulate and thank all of you. And by the way, if I missed a sector, I apologize for that. I meant that to be as inclusive as possible, because I know there's a lot of things that businesses have done to support their community, their state, and their country during this crisis. Let me talk about the 21-22 legislative session. Opened in January. There has been a lot of activity as far as bills that have been proposed, but because we have a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor who don't like each other very much, not a lot's going to get done. There are two exceptions to that, and we're very proud about it because WMC led the way. One is the Paycheck Protection Program. WMC learned that the Wisconsin Department of Revenue was planning on taxing Paycheck Protection Program funds at the state level. It was never intended to be taxed, not at the federal level or the state level, but the DOR decided to interpret it that it was eligible for taxation. And I think they were coveting the $450 million in revenue that they were going to able to bring in if they did tax that. So we sprung into action at WMC, built a coalition with local chambers and other trade associations, worked on a PR campaign to make sure that people understood what was happening. I mean, there were a lot of businesses that took PPP money. They did not reserve funds for paying taxes because they had no idea they had to. They used it for the intended purpose to keep people on the payroll. And we were able to get the legislature on a bipartisan basis to pass a codification that Paycheck Protection Program loans are not taxable at the state level. The governor signed that into law. A week later, we were able to get a huge victory, and that is liability protections for businesses and other entities from COVID-19 related lawsuits. We already knew that we had certain trial attorneys sending letters to the employees of some of our members saying that if you contracted COVID-19, you might have contracted it at work and you should contact us and we'll sue. So there was going to be a huge compounding effect on the economic impact of COVID-19 from lawsuits. So that is a huge bipartisan win. It passed both houses and the governor signed it into law. So we're pleased about that. It showed a rare glimpse of bipartisanship and what has been a very contentious and uncivil time in our body politic. Unfortunately, we're probably not going to see much more of that in this legislative session. The governor did introduce a state budget. When he did, my quote was, it's an irresponsibly anti-business budget. And if it was enacted, the bill would severely erode the state's business climate and hurt our economic competitiveness. And I'll stand by that. And I can give you just some of the most egregious provisions. It repeals Act 10, which of course has saved the taxpayers of the state at least $13 billion over the 10 years that it has been in effect. It repeals the manufacturing portion of the Manufacturers and Agriculture Production Tax Credit, which just is absolutely baffling to me, considering one, how well manufacturers performed during the COVID-19 pandemic, how they bolstered the economy, because many of them, all of them were actually identified as essential, and many of them stayed open and really, I think, kept the economy going. And of course, it's 20% of the Wisconsin economy. 480,000 Wisconsinites work in manufacturing pre-COVID. It has a multiplier effect that no other sector can match. For every one factory job, you create at least 4 jobs in other sectors of the economy. So why the governor would want to go after manufacturing and hurt manufacturing production? And then it also repeals right to work. There are other provisions in there. I'm not going to go through them. I've got a lengthy summary right now up on my screen that I'm staring at. If you want a summary of what's in this bill, contact your chamber and they have a copy of what I'm looking at right now. If they don't, I can get it to them and they can get it to you. But it's pretty egregious. It's definitely anti-business, and frankly, it was dead on arrival as soon as the governor introduced it. And now the legislature will go through the process of piecing together a bill pretty much on their own from scratch. The Joint Finance Committee, which is the budget writing committee, just announced that they will be doing a series of listening sessions around the state. The goal, of course, is to have a budget done by June 30th, but we are not like the federal government. The government does not shut down if we do not pass a budget for the new fiscal year. We continue under the previous budget's allocations. So there's really no threat there of a shutdown, and that's always been a leverage for the Republicans with Tony Evers. What they have said in the past: you either sign our budget into law, or we'll just continue under the previous budget. And I wonder if they'll play that game this time as well. And it'll be also interesting to see. Last time the governor signed the bill, if he's running for re-election, my guess is that he won't. If he isn't running for re-election, my guess is that he will, but we'll have to see, because of course he hasn't announced whether or not he's going to seek re-election. He is raising money, and he has, I think, some conflicting statements on whether or not he wants to run for re-election next year or not. One final thing I'll just mention related to legislative activity. WMC gets involved in political campaigns so that we can elect pro-business people to the legislature. Then, of course, we advocate once they're in the legislature. We identified a gap in our advocacy, and that is on the litigation side, something that the U.S. Chamber has been doing for years through their Institute for Legal Reform. So we now have something called the Wmc Litigation Center, and we are now suing government when they are not abiding by the law, specifically the bureaucracy. So an example would be when the Department of Natural Resources decides that they're going to conjure up some sort of rule. They're required by the legislature to go through a rulemaking process, but very often they don't do that. So we are in the process of suing them right now on an environmental standard that they did not go through the proper process on. So we'll continue to do that. And just one other update on litigation that we're engaged in. You may know that last summer we filed a lawsuit against the Wisconsin Department of Health Services and Governor Evers. They had tried to release the names of businesses that had at least two employees who were tested positive. Reason to do that. That was just going to shame and embarrass, hurt their brand. There was no public health benefit to doing so, because the cases in question were months old at that point, now almost a year old at this point. So we continue to block that. We were successful in Waukesha County. It is now in an appeals court here in Madison, but nothing is scheduled at this point. So knock on wood, we'll be successful on that case as well. So I'll pause there, and John and I would be happy to take questions.
Thank you, John and Kurt. If you do have questions, please drop them into the Q&A chat box below. I'm now going to welcome Jamie Celine, the Vice President of Economic Development and Government Affairs at the Fox Cities Chamber of Commerce, who will be our moderator for the Q&A. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you, Sadie. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Kurt and John. Thank you so much for spending the morning with us. Kurt, I wanted to follow up with you on the budget, because as you stated, there's some pretty disturbing things in there. One of the things is, and what we've seen from the Evers administration, is the attack on the manufacturing and agricultural tax credit. And when I talk to employers, our manufacturers specifically, that is one of the things that they point to as the reason why they're able to stay here and grow here in Wisconsin. Can you talk about how that initiative led by WMC several years ago really kind of brought back the manufacturing viability to the state of Wisconsin?
Well, happy to. We're very proud of that reform. We think that it encourages production and jobs here in Wisconsin. Manufacturing jobs pay 30% above the median. They're not just jobs, they're careers. And again, I already talked about the multiplier effect that manufacturing has. And if you want to rebuild the middle class, how better to do it than with manufacturing? Manufacturing is what created the broad middle class in our country. And I continue to be baffled why this governor just doesn't seem to understand that. According to the Department of Homeland Security recommendations on vaccinations, manufacturers were supposed to be in 1B. We've been pushed to probably somewhere in the C's because the Evers administration just doesn't understand that. I will give the Evers administration credit for assigning all of manufacturing as essential workers when they shut down the economy on March 25th of last year. So I'll give them credit for that. But the Manufacturers and Agriculture Production Tax Credit is just designed to have more and more production here. And there's economic benefit to that. We had Noah Williams from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for the Research of the Wisconsin Economy do a study on this. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't cite the numbers, but it's available, and I'm happy to get it to you if you're interested. It's on their website as well. But the economic impact of manufacturing is significant in this state, and the manufacturer's tax credit has grown the sector. There's more that we probably should do. We have higher than average healthcare costs in Wisconsin, and we have higher than average energy costs in Wisconsin. But from my perspective, I think that we should have a manufacturer's tax credit at the national level. We were able to drop our federal corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. I think that that's great, but I think that if we want to encourage more manufacturing production in the United States, especially post-COVID, because I think one of the things that we learned from COVID is that we need to manufacture PPE and supplies and ventilators and pharmaceuticals here, because I think it really showed a major hole in our supply chain, an economic hole, a national security hole, and just a couple examples other examples, rare earth minerals. We are completely dependent on the Chinese for rare earth minerals that are used for the manufacture of high-tech electronics. And then per electronics, semiconductors, there's a huge shortage right now. And then as we try and work our way into a renewable-based energy grid, we're dependent on the Chinese for batteries, and batteries are pretty vital when you're talking about solar panels and wind turbines. So I appreciate the question, because we're the Manufacturers Association, we're the state chamber. Manufacturing is so important to this state, and we think that the manufacturer's tax credit just gives us a leg up for expansion and development here in Wisconsin on those important manufacturing jobs.
Obviously, and the new coalition, if you look up and down I-41, it's nothing but manufacturing. And so it's a very important part of our economies as well. John, I was hoping that you could kind of reflect. So President Biden has been in office for 50 days now. And in that time, a lot has happened, a lot of executive orders, a lot of different things. Can you kind of give us your assessment of how that's been, how that's gone for the business community? I know one of the things that pops into my mind is the executive order ending the Keystone Pipeline and how that's impacted. It impacts here locally as well, because we have a lot of Wisconsinites and a lot of Wisconsin companies working on that project. Can you kind of give us an assessment on how that 50 days has gone?
Yeah, I think it's kind of gone as expected, right? I mean, there's a lot of talk coming in about working across the aisle, and I think there was some hope that Joe Biden has a long career in the Senate. He was a deal maker in the Senate. He was one of the fewer Democrats that actually liked Republicans back in his time in the Senate, and there was a lot of hope that he would help build some of those coalitions again and trying to get something done in a bipartisan way. And so far, we haven't seen that. Certainly through pushing through this COVID relief package purely on a partisan level. And he kept holding these press conferences saying, hey, if you guys have any changes you want made, let me know. And we were kind of like, we got like 50, right? But they certainly had, this was sold as a COVID relief package, but it's about much more than that, right? They kind of, as they're talking about it now, it's transforming poverty in America and all these different things, which are all good goals, but maybe shouldn't have been included in the COVID relief package. But again, with the executive orders, that's not something that's new. The Trump administration used it, and for the most part, that was good for business. And we certainly expected the Biden administration to come in. The Keystone Pipeline is a great example of that. This is kind of the beginning of what I think we're going to see is going to be an energy policy for this administration, which is going to be a lot about, kind of going back to the Obama years, which is like, let's keep it in the ground, right? Let's not pump the oil. Let's not, put it in pipelines. Pipelines are bad. To Kurt's point, mining is bad, right? If you go up to northeastern Minnesota, not far from there, mining is really bad. But if you don't mine these rare earth metals, you're not going to have your iPhones, you're not going to have your semiconductors, all of these types of things, right? And so I don't think there's been any real surprises for anyone. I think there was some hope that it would be more bipartisan, but they started out, with some, very partisan bills. Now we're hopeful that, whether it's infrastructure or potentially immigration reform, potentially something related to, trade and kind of rebuilding some of those trade relationships globally. I think there is some opportunity for some bipartisanship, but they really kind of poisoned the well right away with going in and doing this budget reconciliation and jamming this bill through because, Republicans can cry foul about being in the minority. That's just life about being in the minority, right? I mean, the Republicans did the same thing to Democrats when they had total control as well. So this isn't like only one party's guilty of this, right? But, the chamber, I always say business issues aren't Republican issues. They're not Democrat issues. They're Main Street issues, right? And so we feel that we are positioned very well in the center on our issues, and that we feel that, we need some bipartisanship in Washington, because if we're going to continue passing, partisan bills down the throat of the minority party, when it does come time to try to get something done in a bipartisan nature, it's going to be a lot harder for Republicans and Democrats to work together. But what I will say is interesting is there's now conversation, and I think we're going to be holding an event or maybe Friday of this week, a conference call about, they're talking about bringing earmarks back again in a much more narrowed focus. And that might be an opportunity. And we're going to be pushing it from a standpoint, not is it good or bad, but if it's coming, what's the role your state and local chamber can play in recommending these projects for consideration. And we feel that might be a way for some bipartisanship as well. But right now, back to your question, Jamie, this isn't, the first 50 days haven't been a huge surprise. Now, there have been successes with the vaccine and the rollout, and things are getting better on the COVID front. How much of that you can attribute to the Biden administration or just the ramp up of production of vaccines, I don't know. But it's been pretty partisan, again, the COVID relief package, jamming through the PRO Act, trying to jam through the $15 minimum wage. I think we can kind of see with their energy policy what we're going to be looking at for the next certainly 2 years, if not 4. And what I'd say is, you want to look back at those Georgia runoffs in December and you want to see how important those were. That's why we are where we are right now. And there's plenty of blame to go around. And I'm not here to identify who's at fault for losing that, but you can look at how important that was. When the election ended in November, I think Republicans felt pretty good because it's Georgia. Republicans win in Georgia. And they weren't as too concerned. And then that went sideways. And here we are 50 days later, and we've got, a $1.9 trillion, COVID relief package and no more Keystone Pipeline and trying to PRO Act and trying to jam through the $15 minimum wage. So to Kurt's point about endorsing pro-business candidates, that's why it matters. And that's why it matters for the business community, whether it's in Georgia or Wisconsin or whatever it is, to nominate and to elect pro-business candidates, because it might seem, one House member, one senator doesn't matter, but when you're in a 50-50 Senate, it couldn't matter more.
Jamie, let me just make a comment about the energy side of things, because Wisconsin is a manufacturing state and we're not an energy producing state, and solar and wind doesn't work very well here. We're trying, of course, but the sun, the sun's not shining today. I used to live in Arizona. It works in Arizona. Wind turbines, we're not in a wind corridor. They're very expensive. They break down a lot. You can't store the energy. They don't have the energy generation capacity that a coal-fired plant or a gas-fired plant or nuclear does. So what the Biden administration does as far as energy will have a big impact on American manufacturing competitiveness. And that's particularly so for Wisconsin, because we have to transfer so much of that energy in. And that's a concern, because you'll recall that the president as a candidate said that he was going to use oil and gas as a bridge to the future until and he recognized that there needs to be technological advancements in solar and wind before they are able to have the affordability and reliability that we see with base loads that we rely on coal, nuclear, or gas. The problem is that he's burning that bridge before we have a chance to get over it, and I think it's incredibly reckless.
We do have a few questions in the chat. So the first one, should Wisconsin accept the Medicaid expansion, which would cover roughly 100,000 and save the state $1.6 billion? I'm assuming, Kurt, that one is over to you.
Our position is no, because it comes with big strings attached to it. They give you free money. It's kind of like, the drug dealer, the first one's free. And then you're hooked, and then suddenly the Wisconsin taxpayer is on the line for it. Frankly, we don't need it, particularly now. As John indicated, they just passed $1.9 trillion that we frankly I don't think need. The first quarter of 2021 is going to have a very robust growth number for GDP, and that's not because of this package. Frankly, it's not because of the package passed in December, because much of that money hasn't been spent yet. To my point earlier about the resiliency of the American economy, we entered COVID-19 in a pretty strong position, and I think that the economy was going to bounce back. I don't think we need the 1.9 trillion, and I don't think we need the Medicaid expansion. And Wisconsin's going to get some money from this $1.9 trillion Rescue America or America Rescue Plan. I forget which one is called. But by and large, because we've been responsible, Act 10. Because we've been responsible, we're not Illinois. We don't have unfunded pension concerns. Minnesota has some, not as bad as Illinois, but that's not the case in Wisconsin. We've been fiscally, I think, prudent, and we should have a benefit for that. And frankly, Wisconsin taxpayers are going to be subsidizing poor management and fiscal practices in other states, which I'm not very happy about.
Yeah, to your point, Kurt, Wisconsin's getting $5.7 billion out of this most recent package, which is a considerable amount of money.
And we just learned yesterday, the Wall Street Journal, if you saw it, they had an editorial on this. You can't cut taxes. If you take the money at all, you cannot cut taxes through 2024. So this is something that Leader Schumer put in because for whatever reason they don't want you to cut taxes. I think philosophically that's just very difficult for me to get my arms around.
Yeah, I guess my other question, one of the things that I've been listening to some of our members talk about is, with all these dollars coming and being spent all over the nation, what's going to happen with inflation? And how is that going to drive up costs? And we've already seen the price of gas go up, and now some of our manufacturers are seeing the price of commodities going up. Is there going to be anything to address inflationary increases due to the printing of money?
John, you want to go first? I've got an opinion.
Well, we'll leave it to the former Bankers Association guy to tackle that, because he's probably the expert there.
Well, look, I don't know the answer. I'm not an economist. I was in banking, but I was in trade association banking as opposed to actual, making loans and so forth. But look, I was critical of the Trump administration. I thought Trump had a lot of good policies, but I did not like the deficit spending and how he ran up the national debt. He wasn't concerned at all about entitlement spending. And of course, Paul Ryan from the great state of Wisconsin, the first speaker of the House from Wisconsin, talked about our entitlement problem being the most predictable economic crisis in our history, because bottom line is that you've got more people drawing benefits and not enough people paying in, and that's a Ponzi scheme that eventually will collapse. So I am concerned about it. I don't know that I can put a fine point on it, but we are spending dramatically. And even Larry Summers, who was Secretary of Treasury under Bill Clinton, so he's a Democrat economist, said that he thought that the 1.9 trillion that Biden wanted to pass, that now we have passed, and the president apparently will sign into law tomorrow, it's too much. and it probably is. I mean, the economy was doing just fine. I guess I would have done more, targeted. Frankly, to John's point, we absolutely need infrastructure investment in this state and in this country. We have underinvested on infrastructure. And from my perspective, there are two things that you need to invest in for the future of your economy: infrastructure and education. And I think that we've fallen behind. So I would have liked to have seen the president put his muscle behind that aspect of things, the infrastructure side of things. So we'll have to see. We probably won't know. I mean, clearly there's politics involved in this. What the president and the Democrats who control Washington right now, other than the Supreme Court, they control two branches of the three branches in Washington. They want to pass this bill, and then when we have an economic boom, they want to take credit for it.
Yeah, if we could kind of segue off it, and we have a question in the chat that I think is a perfect segue, and it's really directed to John. So Wisconsin's labor shortage would benefit from the expansion of legal immigration. What would a business-friendly legal immigration plan look like? And then, Kurt, I'm going to ask you about workforce talent attraction opportunities and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think on the immigration reform part, I think there's a few elements to it. One, the DACA workers, the dreamers, the DACA recipients that are already here, we need to find a way to provide them legal status, right? We already have a workforce shortage. The thought that we're going to identify and round up 800,000 DACA recipients, send them home and tell them to get in line, isn't practical from just a logistical standpoint, but it's not good. It's only going to exacerbate our labor issues. Two, we need to focus more on the high skilled and the low skilled workforce. So whether, you think of low skilled with agriculture, hospitality, you see it with the dairy and the agricultural community in Wisconsin, but also in the high skilled workforce. There's so many people from around the world that are coming to the United States to get educated. And what we're doing is we're educating them and we're kicking them out and we're making them go home to compete against us. We need to find a way to allow those folks who are coming here to get educated here to stay here and continue working in our economy, whether it's the tech sector, the lawyers, accountants, whomever it is. There's this high skilled workforce that we're educating the world to compete against us, right? So we need to, we need to have, we also need to provide employers tools, e-verify tools to verify the legal status so that employers aren't getting put in bad situations where they're hiring someone that they believe to be a legal resident that isn't, right? So we need to protect the businesses there. And we do need some border security. That needs to be part of it as well. Border security needs to be part of any immigration tool we have, but we need to make it easier for businesses. And we don't need immigration for the sake of immigration. We need immigration for the sake of, furthering our economy. So we need it to be targeted largely to the needs that our economy and our businesses have. In Wisconsin, it might be different than it is in Colorado or California, right? And so we need to be able to provide some flexibility for businesses as well. But we need an immigration strategy that includes border security, but also, again, includes protection for the DACA workers and provides more legal immigration status. And this doesn't necessarily mean we're going to give them citizenship, but this gives them workforce status that they can stay here, whether they're high skilled or low skilled. And that's how we're going to solve the problem. Because when as Kurt was saying, the unemployment rate was 13%. Now it's down to 5%. You go to some states, it's at record lows, right? They're going to have workforce issues there. And it's going to get to Kurt's point about how do you attract them to Wisconsin. And right now, my take from when I look at the states I have, the way they're growing is they're trying to rob Peter to pay Paul. Wisconsin's going to grow only if Minnesota and Illinois suffer, right? And the same thing goes for South Dakota is only going to grow if they can steal jobs and steal people from Nebraska and Minnesota and Iowa. So we can't have this rob Peter to pay Paul approach. We need to, and we're not having enough babies to grow organically anymore. So if we're going to grow, we need to get comfortable with the idea of immigration, and we need to find a good way to make it work for our businesses and our communities.
One quick follow-up on that. We just got another question in with the chat is John, what are your thoughts on the E-Verify system?
Forgive me, I'm not as familiar with it enough, but what I do know is that it's not, I don't think it's accessible enough for businesses, and it's not easy enough for businesses to use, and not all businesses are required to use it. So some are using it, some aren't, right? And so we need a uniform program for businesses to have access to it. We need to make sure that it works, but we also need to make sure that businesses are in fact using it. It protects them from hiring the wrong people, but it also protects them from getting in trouble with if you hire the wrong person or people.
Perfect. Thank you. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section, which you can find on the bottom of your screen. Kurt, with the pandemic, I think we've seen that a lot of people are moving out of the big cities and looking for space. And Wisconsin, through the Wisconsin Economic Development Council, had a great campaign about living in Wisconsin, and that campaign has gone away. What are your thoughts? I mean, how are we going to attract talent if we don't tell our story and we don't tell people about all the great amenities we have in our state?
Yeah, it's frustrating. And Jamie, to your point, just for your participants, we lobbied Governor Walker for actually years to institute a talent attraction campaign. We actually did some research in our foundation on what people thought about Wisconsin and what would get them to move here. And we handed that over to the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation under Governor Walker. And eventually Walker finally did allocate some resources for a talent attraction campaign, primarily aimed at Chicagoland, the Twin Cities, Iowa to some extent, then in the Midwest to targeting people who had gone to a Wisconsin college or university, and then veterans as they muster out of the military. The military pays for one move, and Wisconsin has tremendous benefits for veterans. So we saw some success. To John's point, the problem is that we have not been at replacement birth rates in Wisconsin since the 90s. More people leave the state over the last 30, probably longer than that, years, except for 2017 and 2018. Because of that talent attraction campaign, we were able to bring people into the state. Governor Evers decided that he wasn't going to allocate any funds. We were actually able to put an allocation in his budget last time through the Joint Finance Committee. It went untapped. He never used it. He just doesn't see the problem there. I don't know how you don't see the problem, because we are looking at a 0.04% increase in the working age population in Wisconsin. That is economic contraction. It was by far the biggest economic challenge we had pre-COVID. Even during COVID, we had businesses that were desperate to try and find workers. And part of that was that the disincentive that some of these COVID relief packages had for people not to work. We were paying people to stay out of the workforce. In fact, the new package was going to add another $100 per week to people, and that was taken out, fortunately, in the Senate. But it still has incentives for financial incentives for people not to work through August. That just doesn't make any sense at all. We're desperate for workers in the state of Wisconsin. To John's point, the census shows it's not just a Wisconsin problem, it's an upper Midwest problem. We are drawing people in from Illinois. They're largely staying in southeastern Wisconsin, and this is a statewide problem for us. So from our perspective, we're going to have immigration reform. We're hearing some good things from the administration, as John indicated. We've talked to some of our Democrat members of the delegation. In fact, we had our virtual fly-in last week. We talked to Tammy Baldwin and Congressman Kind. I liked what they said about H-1B visa reform, what John was talking about. I'd like to see the entire package. I do think that we need border security. I think that we should get to decide who gets to come across our border. I think that's a public health issue in COVID-19. It's an economic issue. We should be able to decide who's coming in and what skill set and frankly, where they go. Parts of the country don't have a workforce shortage. In the Midwest, we do. So more people should be coming up here. And we have jobs available at low skill, medium skill, and high skill. And we should be able to dictate that. Canada has that relationship with Mexico right now. Frankly, we should borrow that. That's the template from my perspective. But WMC is going to get more aggressive on this at the state level and at the federal level. We need action on this because our economies will contract if we are not able to draw people in.
I think that's a great point. That's the number one issue we hear from members is talent. in all levels of talent. Also, I think we also need to be mindful of retaining the talent that we have. And I know a lot of the chambers in the new coalition have programs such as for 8th grade students to go to career fairs, young professional organizations, leadership programs. So a lot of stuff being done at the local chamber level, and also that talent attraction part of it needs to be done as well from the state and the leadership through WMC, and then also from the leadership of the local chambers. So that's going to be our most limiting factor, I think.
Yeah, it's 3 prongs: talent retention, like you said, exposing every born and raised Wisconsinites to the careers that we actually have available so that they can make choices, because 70% of our jobs don't require a 4-year degree. That does not mean that they're not great careers. I mentioned manufacturing, the professional skilled trades, electricians, plumbers. We have lots of openings there. If you know, last winter I had a pipe burst and it took forever for me to be able to get a plumber out there. When he came, he said he can't find anybody to work for him. That's a challenge. And I live in Dane County. This is a populated part of the state. Talent attraction, we already covered that. And then talent reintegration. Labor participation rate in Wisconsin is actually well above the national average, but there's still 30% of eligible workers in this state that are out of the workforce for whatever reason. And we don't need incentives from government to keep people out of the workforce. Our economic surveys tell us, our members say that their number one competitor for talent right now is government benefits.
Wow.
And Jamie, the one thing I'd add with that too, to Kurt's point, is it's because of COVID, a lot of people have left the workforce, right? Their kids are home. So we need to get the kids back to school. And secondly, you know, I was reading an article not that long ago about how we could lose in our country 50% of our childcare capacity as it relates to COVID.
Yeah.
Because kids aren't going to childcare centers, they're shutting down. What's going to happen when your employer says, all right, it's time to go back to the office, but you don't have anywhere to send your kid? Childcare and getting back to school are going to be barriers for people returning to work.
Great point.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another follow-up question on the whole talent thing. So, Kurt, since you're taking the lead in pushing Governor Evers and WDC to try to do a campaign, if the state determines not to do that, is that something, an effort that WMC would help lead?
We'd have to raise money for it. I mean, it costs money. The allocation that Governor Walker had was only about $10 million. And I was very impressed with how wise WEDC was with those funds. I thought they researched it well and they spent it well. We have talked about this, and that has come up before. You know, my annual budget is $8 million a year. So, I mean, I'd have to raise the money. You know, for right now, I don't have the bandwidth. I'm like many of you on this call. We've been impacted by COVID-19 as well. I started 2020 with 40 employees. I've got 29 right now. I'm hiring about 4. But the point is that everything's about resources, and I just don't have the bandwidth right now. I'd be open to it, but you know, what we really need right now, I think, is for government officials to stop nodding when you talk about workforce and actually doing something about it. And that's been the big challenge that we've had, is that there's a lot of agreement, because the politicians hear this too. When they do plant tours or they talk to constituents, they hear it too. We need to give them tangible action items, and I think we have, and they need to act on it. And if they don't, then we've got to hold them accountable.
Yeah, great point. One of the scariest stats that I cite on a regular basis is in the Appleton MSA right now. We have over 8,300 open, unduplicated job filings online. And I believe in the Green Bay MSA, it's over 10,000. So those are a lot of jobs out there that are going unfilled just because we don't have the bodies, which is very scary. All right, wanted to switch back, switching gears. We have a question in the chat about the PRO Act. Should it pass, do states have any power to limit the effects of the act, especially Wisconsin businesses that currently have active unions?
You know, what's interesting about the PRO Act is the PRO Act came up last year. This one's actually worse than the one that came up last year, because why it's worse? One of the reasons it's worse, it also affects companies that exist that already have unions. So we've always looked at the PRO Act in terms of unions trying to come in and operate in a business that's not unionized, right? but it also has some effects on businesses that are currently unionized. One of them is, and forgive me for not knowing the exact details on it, but one of them has to do with these micro strikes where you can kind of strike for 1 or 2 days and you were allowed to have so many, and then at that point they became illegal. That's not the case anymore. Another one has to do relating with if someone strikes, a business, would not necessarily have to hold that. They wouldn't necessarily get their position back if they struck. A business, typically would have to hold their job for so long, and then they could fill the position. Now, when the business strikes, the union strikes, when the person comes back and says, I want my job back, now the business would actually have to give them their job back, even if they've already filled that after the fact. So this bill does have some negative impacts for existing union shops as well. And in the past, it's kind of been, the business community would look at it and be like, the non-unionized folks are like, this is really bad. The unionized folks would kind of say, yeah, it's not good, but we're already a union shop, so it doesn't really affect us. This does have effect for them, and it's going to undo your right to work in Wisconsin and all those other things that Kurt talked about and we discussed earlier. So this isn't just bad for business, that non-union businesses, this is bad for everybody.
Great. Another question in the chat is, aside from the obvious of contacting our legislative people to vote in one way or the other, what can the average person do to help legislate positivity for business?
Well, grassroots response is really critical. I would highly recommend that everybody listening, business owners, no matter how small you are, no matter how big you are, do an economic impact summary of your business and share it with lawmakers. Invite lawmakers, local, state, federal, the governor, to come and visit your location so that they can see firsthand what you do, who works for you, and it's a chance for you to explain the challenges that you have. We have a governor right now who's worked his entire life in government. He's a school teacher, school administrator, superintendent of public instruction. He doesn't understand business, and that's not a criticism. It genuinely is not. But the point is, he just doesn't know. A lot of lawmakers don't know. They don't have to have ever hired anyone or fired anyone or balanced a budget before to get elected to whatever office that they're in. And many of them don't assume that they understand business. Invite them to come in and make sure that how many employees do you have? How much do you pay? What do you pay in taxes? What's your philanthropy? These types of things. A lot of businesses do this, more need to. Frankly, every business should be doing that and sharing it with their local, their state, and their federal elected officials.
Yeah, and what I'd add to that, Jamie, is that, there was a survey out recently, and trusted sources of information, right? We self-select our media, right? Largely, if you're Republican, you're following certain media. If you're Democrat, you're following certain media. Media is not up there. Politicians aren't up there. One of the number one trusted sources of information in any given person's life is their employer, right? They trust their employer. So like Kurt says about telling these stories to your legislators, as an employer, I feel you have a duty and obligation to share this with your employees as well. What is our company doing in our community beyond handing you a paycheck every 2 weeks, right? What is the impact that any given legislation is going to have on our business? Because I always say, like, I get paid to lobby people, members of Congress, to vote on things, which is why I ask Kurt and I ask Jamie and Sadie and others to contact their legislators, because they're constituents. If you're a business owner, you need to actively say, hey, you need to contact Ron Johnson and say, vote for this, vote against this, but you need to keep them informed. I think it's your duty and obligation to say, listen, this is the impact the PRO Act would have on our business. This is the impact that, infrastructure in a positive way would have on our business. And you need to, just as you need to share everything with your members of Congress and your elected officials, you need to share that with your employees, and that's going to inherently activate them to become more active in telling your story. You can't be the only one to tell your story.
Absolutely, absolutely. The governor has declared the year of water. Then the water quality is going to be measured at drinking water quality level all the time. And one of the concerns, one of the recent, I guess, kind of don't know how to state this, but PFAS. I'm trying to get to PFAS here. There are over 4,000 different variations of PFAS chemicals used in a variety of different ways, from firefighting foam to food packaging that is FDA approved. And the governor has basically said that he had a council on water the same, and we're going to regulate them so that we're going to be down to, I think it was like 7 million or parts, no, 7.7 trillion part per trillion. I'll get that right the next time I try to lobby on that. But it's extremely restrictive, and it's used in so many applications, and it's concerning for our manufacturers in this area that they're either pulling in water that already has PFAS in it, and now they're going to be expected to test that, clean it, and dispose of that water. That's a huge impact, and it really hasn't been studied. And at our chamber, we have a position that we want science-based regulation on this. Just, Kurt, wanting your thoughts on how big of an impact is this going to be, and is there a way that we can get to that science-based and not just a one-size-fits-all for the PFAS issue?
Yeah, one size fits all seems to be the watchword or the watch phrase for this meeting. Group in the state that has a lobbyist assigned specifically to environmental issues. So we've been very much involved in this. In fact, one of the things that we're suing the government on right now is on PFAS regulation, because we think, of course, that they should regulate it. It's just a matter of the rulemaking process that they engage in. They have to follow the rules just like we have to follow the rules in business. They don't always do that, and the only way to hold them accountable is to sue them. But you're right. I mean, the standards that they're coming up with are not science-based. They're out of line with what the EPA wants to do at the federal level, what Canada has done, what the EU has done. We're talking about 2 droplets in an Olympic-sized pool. Incredibly expensive remediation, and the science isn't even there as far as negative health benefits. Now, I don't want to be misquoted here. We believe that we've got to protect the environment and be good stewards. But of course, PFAS are one of those elements and compounds, and you're absolutely right, Jamie. There's I think 4,000 of them. We didn't really know the impact of them, and we use them for firefighting foam and for nonstick cookware. Your Gore-Tex jacket has PFAS. You mentioned certain packaging. If you get a hamburger from McDonald's, the coating has got PFAS on it. It's absolutely everywhere. And I think that we need to take a step back and understand the science before we do something that is really economically debilitating to manufacturers in particular. So WMC is working on this. We've been very involved. It's a tough one because the press loves to portray us as being pro-polluter, and we're seeing a lot of that. And I wonder if John could maybe speak to this, but we're seeing a lot of manufacturers being accused of being polluters, which is just infuriating. Because we need manufacturing, and of course they're not we do something called Business Friend of the Environment every year to highlight what manufacturers and other businesses are doing to protect the environment and being good stewards of the environment and conservation. But it's a tough issue because it's being portrayed as polluters versus regulators, and that's not fair. That's not true. We want clean water. But we also need to make sure that we understand all of the complexities of this issue, because it is really complex, as you indicated, as you were leading into it. It's and frankly, I'm just scratching the surface because I'm not the expert. I've got, fortunately, my chief lobbyist, who used to be our environmental lobbyist, and our current environmental lobbyist know this backwards and forwards and are working on it pretty much every day.
And I just want our participants to know that the most hazardous PFAS have already been banned, and there's already remediation undergone to clean that up. So we're really talking about the ones that are kind of in the middle that we don't know a lot about.
Great point.
John, do you know if there's going to be any, and this might be a little too niche or too specific, but any federal, I know that the EPA is looking at it, but any federal legislation or anything coming down to help address, because PFAS isn't an issue just in Wisconsin. It's all over.
Certainly, I don't know a lot about it, but I know they're certainly talking about it. And I know Senator Whitehouse is, one of the big proponents of it. And I know it's a constant battle between us and his office in trying to talk this through, similar to Kurt's point. But I know they are talking about it in Washington. I don't believe there's anything that is coming down the pike to manage it. This is one of those things, frankly, that what Kurt's battling there is, it's hard to get things through Congress, right? So let's just not do anything and leave it up to the regulators to do it. And my guess is if we see it, it'll probably come through the EPA, in which, if Kurt's saying Wisconsin's more restrictive than the EPA, the EU, and Canada, I don't think anyone would accuse those three of being some like hardcore conservative groups out there. So it kind of demonstrates how far to the left that regulation's gone.
For sure. My last topic, unless we have more questions in the chat, and feel free to put any questions in the chat, and we'll make sure that those get asked. But my last topic is really about housing. And Wisconsin is always known as having a low cost of living. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people love to live here. But the cost of housing, we have a housing shortage, and that means that our housing costs are going up. We have the increased cost of construction. A lot of that's pandemic related, but also workforce related. Also related to the stimulus checks, so that, because I'm hearing from construction companies that stimulus checks come out, employees don't show up to work for a week or two. What can we do about the housing initiative, or the housing, not crisis, but getting close to the crisis in Wisconsin? How do we address that?
It's not easy. And you're absolutely right. This is part of the workforce problem. When we talk to our members in rural areas, so just for frontline workers, there is not good affordable housing available, and it's challenging to get developers to build. But some communities, the challenge is high-end housing for your executives, your engineers, and so forth. So that's a challenge as well. We're seeing a lot of businesses adopt practices from the past. Mainly, if you've ever been to the American Club in Kohler, you know that was a dormitory for immigrant labor to work in the plant across the street. I'm from Beloit. Fairbanks Moores and Beloit Corporation built similar housing for migrant labor coming up from Mississippi to work in the factories. I think we're seeing more and more of that. I've got a lot of members that are building temporary facilities for their employees. I think we're probably going to see more of that. I mean, the challenge we have is that if you're a builder, your costs are fixed. And if you build in Madison, you can charge more for rents and leases than you can if you're building in Little Chute. So oftentimes, my costs are fixed. I can get a quicker return on my investment if I build in an urban area. Although I will say we've got the problem in urban areas too. I was just I haven't been to Milwaukee in probably 6 months. I was on one of these calls with someone from Milwaukee complaining about the fact that their lower end workers are having trouble finding housing as well. So I don't have a good answer for this. This is part of the challenge on workforce generally that we spend so much time addressing. Unfortunately, there's just not one easy solution for any of them.
Yeah, and I'd add, for me, if we're looking to the federal government or the state government to solve this problem, it's going to get solved, but it's going to get solved in a very bad, costly, and inefficient way, right? And these are the things that are going to happen on the local level. You look at some states, the cost of housing is high. You look at my state, Minnesota. A lot of the reasons the cost of housing is high is because there's a lot of state regulations that go into building a house, building an apartment building, whatever it might be. But it becomes kind of a chicken and the egg thing. Like, is a developer going to come build something in your community if it's not going to have a certain level of capacity filled right away? But then you can't get people to say, I'm going to come live in your community unless there's somewhere for me to live, right? And so I feel like a lot of this is going to be done, to Kurt's point, through businesses, through local communities, through community organizations are going to what ultimately tries to fix this problem, because it's not unique to Wisconsin, anywhere. It's a problem that's spread across the entire country.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I'm out of questions. So I think we can safely say that we have discussed everything under the sun and we can move forward. So I want to thank John and Kurt, not only for being here today, but everything that you've done to help our chambers and our members through the pandemic. Kurt, with the leadership in the taxation of the paycheck protection, the liability issues, that has really eased a lot of minds of our members, and thank you for your leadership on that. John, the information that you have been putting out, the U.S. Chamber has been putting out on childcare and the vaccines and all that stuff has been tremendously useful. So thank you for all of that. And I want to just thank everyone else for attending today, and hope you stay in contact with your local chamber. Thank everyone from the NEWCC Coalition, which is the Greater Green Bay Chamber, the Waupaca Chamber, the Fox Cities Chamber, going down Highway 41. So Oshkosh Chamber, and Envision Fond du Lac. So thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care.